Interesting question about which came, it's the old chicken and egg thing. Which came first, human ethics or our faith, religion? Ian Burchell has done some research into this one, and he's written about it in his book called The Ethics of the Faith, Right, Wrong, and the God of Abraham. And it has to do with the monotheistic religions, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all called the Abrahamic religions, and whether or not these religions produce the ethics by which most of us live our lives, or the other way around. Ian Burchell joins us tonight from Toronto. Ian, when we talk about faith and ethics, the two are inextricably intertwined, and when we talk about the Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, can you talk about some of the common threads that you found?
Well, first I'd like to challenge the very first thing you made, and that is that faith and ethics are intertwined. I think that that concept of being intertwined is highly questionable and a largely mistaken concept. I think a lot of people believe that to be so, but if you look at what people might say, well, these are Christian values, or these are the ethics and morality I learned from Christianity. Compare that to the ethics and the values that you would learn from Judaism, from Islam, from Buddhism, from Hinduism, Jainism, etc. I think what we would find is these are human values. They're really not connected to any particular faith.
So that the values, you're saying that the values we have of, not doing harm to one another and so forth are not directly connected to these faiths? Because, surely in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Moses coming down with the tablets kind of laid down those laws, didn't he?
Well, he laid down certain laws with the tablets and then a whole lot of other laws in what we call the Mosaic Code or the Mosaic Canon. But the basic notion that you mentioned of not doing harm, not accepting harm being done to yourself, not doing harm to others, is something that predates any of the Abrahamic faiths, and it's something that crosses every culture. It's certainly to be found in Christianity in what we call the Golden Rule. It's to be found in ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the hedonists under Epicurus. It's to be found in Confucianism. It's to be found in the Judaic tradition. But it really would be a difficult job, probably an impossible task, to find any culture, past or present, that didn't have at its core a notion that doing harm is a wrong thing. Now, what certain faiths, and some to a greater extent than others, have done was hijack that essential human survival instinct and principle and said this is connected to a particular God. That can be useful in terms of using that power, that awesome power, as a coercive force to prevent people from doing harm or from doing things like stealing or committing infidelities or committing fraud. But that does not in any way mean that this is the origin. In fact, as I said, I think we can find that these notions of not doing harm or not accepting harm being done to oneself cross all cultures.
So how far back then do we have to go, Ian, to find the roots of those kinds of values? Because, when we kind of crawled out of the slime, we didn't have those. So where did those values begin to take shape?
Well, I think there's some people would question whether we climbed out of the slime. I'm not one of those, but certainly a lot of people of faith would challenge that notion. But we can go all the way back, and that is the very, very beginnings of social communities, and that really starts with the most primitive, the smallest units, and that's families, and families that eventually turn into smaller tribal units, and then they get larger and larger. Now, within a small, say, tribal society, it is less important, less necessary to have formalized or codified rules that say things like do not steal something which is not yours, or do not commit an act of violence, or do not commit an infidelity with someone else's partner, because everybody is in full plain sight of each other all the time, and so that the idea of being caught, or the fear of being caught, is right there. If you live in a small, close-knit tribal society, as the societies grow, and they're wider, and they come in contact with others, and there's competition for scarce resources, particularly food and water, then there's going to be more conflict, and therefore you start to codify things. And some of the wisest things that some of the ancient and primitive rulers have done was say that these rules that I'm setting down didn't just come from me, a very powerful man. They actually came from, and then they just name a particular god.
In the Judeo-Christian tradition, if the world being created in 6 days, and then God creating man, and then a woman as a companion. So were those laws not laid down first by God? But you're saying that they were laid down by man and then attached later to the deity.
Yeah, most definitely. And these laws certainly predated in any history that we have of the laying down of the Decalogue, for example, which people claim. That this claim, interestingly, is made, I think, much more fiercely by Christians than it even is by Jews, who, of course, are the original monotheists in the Abrahamic tradition. That is, that this is the foundation, the very basis of morality and ethics, and that is the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and then all of the other Mosaic laws that follow. And if we look at the Ten Commandments, and there are a few different translations that have been found, but they're essentially the same. There are certain things in there that clearly have nothing to do with right and wrong. The ultimate one being, the first, and that is obedience to one particular deity. And it's actually kind of obvious within those commandments that this deity recognizes the existence of others, and he's quite jealous of this. Other things, like honoring your father and mother, that has a bit of a tenuous connection to ethics as well. It does sound, on the face of it, like a pretty good idea. On the other hand, there are fathers and mothers that perhaps, and they more often fathers than mothers, don't deserve in any way to be honored by their children. But later on in the Mosaic Code, it makes it clear that regardless, if you dishonor your parents or disrespect your parents, the Mosaic Code prescribes death as a punishment for that. Might have been better for this all-knowing, all-loving deity to say that parents should honor their children and be kind and nurturing towards them than that. But then if we look at other parts of the Decalogue where it says, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, it's really ludicrous to think that before these were dictated, as the mythology tells us, to Moses on Mount Sinai, that the children of Abraham were going about killing and stealing because they didn't realize that these things were wrong, or that nearby tribal societies were doing the same, or that distant societies which existed at that time, the societies of Latin America, or what we now call Latin America, the societies of Eastern Asia, that these societies which had no knowledge of the Decalogue and Moses and Mount Sinai were unaware that theft and murder and adultery were not to be recommended.
If we sort of go with that then and decide that the whole notion of ethics has attached itself rather than God dictating the ethics, that humans have attached this code of ethics to their deity, where are the common threads there?
The common threads amongst the Abrahamic faiths, or the common threads amongst societies? Well,
it's just among the Abrahamic faiths, because that's essentially what you're talking about here in this work, right?
Yeah, in my book, that's what I tackle is the origins of the Abrahamic faiths, and in particular the central character, and that is Yahweh, or he's sometimes called Jehovah, most often simply called God with a capital G. And the reason why I do this is because roughly 50% of the world today claim to be adherents to varying degrees of devotion to one of the three Abrahamic faiths, that is Judaism, this being the smallest, although the original, Christianity, and Islam. But all three of these, now there's some great differences amongst these faiths and differences within these faiths, but the three owe their origin and their very root to what we call the Torah and other books of the so-called Old Testament, to this particular character, this God that we refer to as Yahweh in the Old Testament. And that's the commonality of them.
We're going to talk more to Ian Burchell about ethics, faith, which came first. His book is called The Ethics of the Faith, Right, Wrong, and the God of Abraham. This is the Nighthawk on 680 CJOB.
Listening to the Nighthawk on 680 CJOB. Call now at 204-780-6868, even if you don't want to admit you're wrong.
I'm talking about faith, ethics, where they come from, where ethics comes from. Ian Burchell, spelled with an E, E-A-N, Burchell. His book is called The Ethics of the Faith, Right, Wrong, and the God of Abraham, and we'll carry on with our conversation with him. We call these Abrahamic faiths, but so talk to me about who this guy was and how he came to formulate this monotheistic view of the universe, which was contrary to what had been held before by so many.
Well, there's there's a bit of a false notion there that Abraham was in fact a monotheist. Now, there's not a whole lot that we can find in the Old Testament to talk about the details of the origin of Abraham's faith itself. But he's considered the ultimate patriarch, the one that God, that Yahweh chose to be the father of a great nation, as he said, and chose to populate the world with his chosen people, acknowledging that there were lots of other tribes and peoples who would not be amongst the chosen. But if we look at the Old Testament itself, there is no suggestion that Abraham believed that this God was the only God, and there's no suggestion that this God insisted he was the only one. He was the God of this one particular tribal leader. This tribe came to be known as the Hebrews, and then later on Jews, as history changed and different boundaries were drawn in different ancient kingdoms. So the notion that in its origin, the origin of these faiths was in fact monotheistic is not quite true. It was clear that there were other competitor gods within that region. Now, it's believed by tradition that Abraham actually originated in a city called Ur, which is in modern-day Iraq. But there's contention amongst biblical scholars as to whether or not that's correct, or whether if this particular person existed, or some version of this person, or the story itself. There's argument that it probably, amongst some, probably actually did originate in the area that we now call Israel Palestine, but by suggesting that he went and, or his descendants went and conquered and took over another land, gave more legitimacy to the ownership of that land, because of course conquest at the behest of a god is a very, very powerful argument for ownership of property.
So should the followers of the Abrahamic faith still acknowledge that there may be other gods? Are they getting it wrong? Because there is, I think there's a kind of a consensus among most of the followers of those three faiths we're talking about that there are no other gods. But that's, as you said, that's not what the Old Testament necessarily says.
Well, the Old Testament does move towards monotheism, as you know. The history of the Jewish people, or the Hebrew people, if we want to go back far enough, it does eventually evolve into this is the only God. But it's not that way at the beginning, and there are throughout. You could probably be almost halfway through the 39 books of the Old Testament. You're still finding references to these other gods, but they're not suggested that these are merely idols or false gods. They're competitor gods. But the faith of the Hebrews did evolve such that it did become, a few thousand years ago, a belief that it's not just that he's our God, he is the only one. But really importantly, that development caused problems that we still see today, and that is, once you believe that your God is the only one, and you are the only chosen group to win the favor of that God, that automatically puts everybody else on the face of the earth in the category of the other. And it's not difficult to find lots and lots of stories in the Old Testament where very horrific things are done to the other in the name of, and often at the command of, this particular God.
When we start to think that our personal theology is actually bigger than God, that's when we start to run into trouble.
Well, if you believe your personal theology is bigger than God, then what you probably are is you believe you are, or maybe you are a bit of a charlatan, or you believe you're some sort of a prophet, so that you think that this particular God has chosen you to take your flock in a certain direction, or a different God. But if we start thinking that this God that so many people are devoted to is a part of the mythology of a certain group of people at a certain period of time, then we're not putting ourselves above God. We're saying, well, we are human beings, and what we've done is we've evolved socially through thousands of years, sometimes very painfully, sometimes experimenting in ways that go horribly wrong, and sometimes experimenting in ways that go very right, and we become better and more civilized. So it's not a matter of putting ourselves above God when we recognize that the God of the Old Testament is equivalent to the gods of the Norse pantheon, or the ancient Egyptians, or any other ancient societies that we might want to talk about.
The God of the Old Testament that many people are familiar with, and it may be glanced over by a lot of people, Ian, this was a God that possessed a lot of the same kinds of characteristics that human beings possess, and that you mentioned jealousy. There's an enormous vengeful streak there of this sense of extreme punishment in some cases. I mean, horrific punishment. And so there are a lot of human emotions attached to Jah, Yahweh, whatever we want to say, whatever word you want to use.
Well, of course, this character is a human creation, and therefore he's got all of the human attributes that we might want to think of. And we can find some very positive attributes. Honestly, not very many in the Old Testament God. We find more in his manifestation that Christians believe to have been, one in being with the same God later on in the New Testament with Jesus. And we can find some with the character of Muhammad, who is not considered a God but a prophet. But this particular God is very vindictive and very jealous. And really what he shows largely is the character of an earthly tyrant, only much more so because he has more power than an earthly tyrant. You can't see him. You can't hear him. Sometimes you can in a burning bush or a dust cloud or something like that. But generally, he's mysterious. He's everywhere. He's all powerful. He's unquestionable. He is cruel. He is vindictive. He's capricious. He possesses all of the characteristics that a human being possesses, and largely the very negative characteristics that you would find in a tyrant, which is to be expected because this is primarily a God who wants fear and obedience, and that's made very, very clear in the original text.
Ian Burchell's book is called The Ethics of the Faith. We're going to pick up on this conversation when we return. This is the Nighthawk on 680 CJOB. 1-1 there in the second. We're talking to Ian Burchell, author of The Ethics of the Faith, Right, Wrong, and the God of Abraham. There's a sense of this notion of personal choice, of the fact that we are all kind of free agents. And in ancient Greece, I know that a lot of the time the feeling seemed to be that whatever happened, it was because the gods had ordained it that way. In monotheism, it seems that this whole notion of ethics and behavior is a matter of personal choice. And so that's where ethics come into play.
Well, ethics come into play, of course, in all of these discussions. Now there's a rich tradition in ancient Greek philosophy about the argument over whether or not we are moral free agents or whether or not we are toys in the hands of the gods. The notion that in monotheism and in Christianity and the others that we are free agents, that we have free will, is something that was made up later on, and it's seems to be, when I look at it, one of those things that is used to get God out of a difficult situation. When good things happen, it's often because God has intervened, and when bad things happen, it's because, well, we are sinners and we're imperfect. Now, I looked very, very carefully, and now I have actually read the entire New Testament, and I've read some of the Quran, but I haven't read these with great care. I did read, of course, to finish this book, the 39 books of the Old Testament, with great care, and nowhere are the words free will used. Nowhere is it suggested that we have been given free will by Yahweh, by God. But many times we can find him intervening directly in human affairs without having been asked to do so, and having the men, it's usually men we're talking about, make decisions that he wants them to make, and then he follows up by punishing them for having made those decisions.
There are several references in the Old Testament, though, to men being stiff-necked, to us being resistant to the will of God.
Mm-hmm. These are, and we can find this quite a few times, and this exact term has been used over the centuries since the advent of Christianity.
Yeah, so what do we make of that? What do we make of that phrase? How do we interpret that phrase?
Well, if we look at it, it's used frequently. What happens is the God of the Old Testament will do something to assist. Will make it look like he assists his people, for example, in the Exodus and the escape slavery. Although importantly, if we understand the history of that region, when the Hebrews, if this really happened, escaped slavery in Egypt, that same God allowed many other non-Hebrews to remain as slaves. But that's a different discussion. But they will have been set free from Egypt and then left to wander in the desert for, well, as it says, 40 years. We're talking about, at that period of time, something that would be more than a generation if we consider the what should be the average lifespan of a person. And in that desert, they keep hearing the promises of the milk and honey and the promised land and so forth. And every now and then they will complain. There's one point where they complained that they had no water. And here they were in a desert. And so their God just gets angry with them and calls them stiff-necked people. It basically means they're being stubborn. They're not trusting fully in God by complaining that they have no water. And then they're punished. they do the same thing when they say that they don't have any food.
Do we come to any kind of conclusions about these common threads in ethics? I mean, you talk about the ethics of faith, and so has faith brought us any sense of ethics? Has this monotheism bequeathed us any of the sort of the values or ethics that we have now, or is it all, as you said, things that have grown out of human culture that are common worldwide?
Well, I do believe that there are many people now, and there are many people in the past who believe that they have receive their ethical core, their moral guidance or compass from their faith, and that can lead people into doing good things. That you can have missionaries who do good things. I actually don't think missionaries who try to convert people to another religion is a good thing, but there are missionaries who actually bring food to people and dig wells and so forth. So those are good things. If you act in a kind, loving, and caring way, and you believe it's because of your faith, well, I can't condemn that, but I would suggest very strongly that a person who does a good thing, a person who volunteers to help the homeless in the city of Toronto, working through let's say a Catholic organization, is a person who would volunteer to help the homeless in the city of Toronto through a non-Catholic organization as well. If that person is a good person, they may believe that comes from faith, and if they do, and it fulfills their lives and it does no harm, then I couldn't possibly say there's anything wrong with that, except for that, perhaps it's based on a fairy tale, but if it's a harmless fairy tale, so be it.
So where did this notion then begin, Ian, where we have come to believe that ethical behavior has sprung out of our faith rather than the other way around?
Well, it's really from the origins of these faiths and other faiths as well, but very strongly in the monotheistic faiths, that we have certain fears. We have fear of death and fear of the dark and fear of the unknown, and we have lots of questions about the universe and life and why people get sick and why people die and why there are storms and why the crops failed and so forth. So we come up with all kinds of answers, and a lot of the answers are there's an all-powerful God. Now, it's a very good thing, or let's not say good, it's a very useful thing if you want to control a population to say, well, there's going to be some fantastic rewards later on in paradise, and get people to believe that if you behave in this particular way, which we would like to call good, and there are going to be horrific punishments if you behave in this other way, which we'll call bad. We can see this with children who are 6 years old, and it's October, November, and we increasingly tell them that Santa Claus is watching them the whole time, and they might start behaving a little bit better because they think they're going to get these presents, or they think if they're behaving in a naughty way, then they might get that proverbial lump of coal. I think it might be better to teach children behave for other reasons than here comes Santa and he's watching you the whole time. But this is really how it begins. And certain rulers, and this is not just in the primitive world, this is true today, it's been true throughout history, have taken full advantage of the credulity that people have in their gods, which has to really be built into them when they're children, in almost every case, as a tool, as a weapon. There's a lot of obedience that has been paid to rulers, secular rulers, or theological rulers, or the clergy, and hand in hand with the kings or the emperors in the past, and even in many parts of the world today. So it's a very, very useful tool.
We're going to talk more about this notion of ethics, faith, and where both come from with Ian Burchell. I think we're going to hold him over if we can and talk a little bit more in the next hour. His book is called The Ethics of the Faith, Right, Wrong, and the God of Abraham. And you're listening to The Nighthawk on 680 CJOB.
Don't go anywhere.
10:05 on this Thursday edition of The Nighthawk, and I guess it's not inappropriate to say Happy Pesach and Happy Easter to one and all as we continue our conversation with Ian Burchell, author of The Ethics of the Faith, Right, Wrong, and the God of Abraham, as we pursue Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This is where the New Testament parts company there, right? Because the notion of the New Testament is that you can't behave your way into paradise or into heaven, that you can only get there through grace and through belief, that's kind of where Christianity parts company with a lot of these other faiths.
Yes, well, there was one of the early church fathers called Marcion who attempted to convince the other church fathers to separate Jesus Christ from Yahweh, from the God of the Jews of the Old Testament, and declare him to be the God, and the other one no longer pertains, but he was declared a heretic, so that didn't work very well. So there still is that connection. A lot of Christians like to say, well, that's the old covenant, and now there's a new covenant. It's very important to acknowledge that. It says so, right in the words of the Gospels, that that the Father and the Son are one, that Jesus came to fulfill the laws, not to destroy them. But there's no argument that if we look at the books of the New Testament, and we look at the central character of Jesus Christ, who appears, of course, in a minority of the books in the New Testament, there is nowhere near that violence and that theft and that fraud and that rape, and that's not there. This is a much gentler version of Yahweh. But what has remained important in Christianity, and it has had some pretty horrific effects, is that it's still central that there is only one way to paradise. There's only one way to the Father, which is this same Father, this Yahweh. That is through Jesus. So just like in the days of old, when the only possible salvation was to be one of the chosen of Yahweh, that is the children of Israel, and later on, in fact, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel lost favor with their God. Then Christians developed the theology, the belief that the only way to salvation was through faith in Jesus Christ. There is no other way, and in fact, the doctrine of hell was very well developed by Christians. It really was not well developed in Judaism at all. Christians really developed this, and there's only two alternatives: faith in Jesus or going to hell. So that has led to a lot of really horrific things as well. We're not just talking about crusades and wars of conquest and colonialism throughout the Americas and Asia. We can look at, here in Canada, something very recent, and that is the residential schools. Now, the government of Canada has apologized for the horrific things that happened to thousands of Aboriginal children and their families over the decades. But what actually happened was at the hands of churches. The governments in this country turned the care, if we want to use that word, of these children over to the churches. And I think you could probably find many of the brothers and the nuns and the priests and the different church people who very badly abused these children, believed that they were doing the right thing because the only possible salvation for these people was to become civilized Christian people. Otherwise, they were bound for hell. So the abuse was necessary, just as it was necessary to burn people at the stake in the Middle Ages.
Overall, do you see this? Do you see faith and religion in the grand scheme of human history as a greater force for good or for ill?
I think it's a greater force for ill. I think it has had its place. I think there are some usefulnesses to it. A lot of those usefulnesses pertain to control and power. A lot does pertain to things like giving people comfort about their loved ones when they're sick. If that makes you feel better when your loved one's sick, that some God is watching over and will intervene and will make your loved one better, then I can't really condemn that comfort that you feel. But again, if we go another step, that can lead to people deciding that prayer is more important than medicine. And we do see.
Well, yeah, those cases, Ian, those cases are exceedingly rare. They're so rare that they make the news.
That's right. They're exceedingly rare right now, and that's because in Western society, and it took a lot of fighting, and there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and probably more blood than sweat and tears over the centuries to bring us here, so that we could wrest this power away from the established churches.
Overall, one of the great sort of factoids that's been bandied out there is that more wars have been committed in the name of religion than anything else. That's not true, of course. But
no, I don't believe that's true at all.
No, and clearly it's not, and history will tell us that. However, all faiths seem to have some blood on their hands, and so how do we jive the ethics, the purported ethics of and we're talking about the monotheistic religions here, but this seems to cut across again all societies, that we've all got some blood on their hands.
Well, certainly blood on our hands in warfare and violence and conquest cut across all societies. All faiths are not equally tainted with this. The monotheistic faiths are very much so. Judaism, less so, because an awful lot of the blood and genocide and pillage and so forth that's attributed to the ancient Hebrews and later on the Israelites in the books of the Old Testament, a lot of that is simply mythology. It didn't quite really happen that way. But certainly there was an awful lot of blood and conquest and pillage in the name of God later on by Christian and Muslim generals and armies and kings and so forth. Other faiths, less so. There certainly has been blood committed in the name of the Buddha by certain Japanese warrior monks centuries ago. Certainly, there's blood and there's many violent things going on in India even today in the clash between nationalist Hindus and Muslims. I think we can take the Jains out of this. I think the Jains don't really commit any acts of violence, but I think what your point is well made, that one, you put faith in this all-powerful deity which has selected you and your particular people, your tribe, your nation, your group as his instrument, then that gives you license to commit horrible atrocities against those who are not within that congregation.
Right. I mean, if you think you have God wrapped up and stuffed in your back pocket, that you think you possess God rather than the other way around, you can go down some dangerous paths.
You can do no wrong. If you do have, as you say, God wrapped up in your back pocket, you really can do no wrong. And this is something that, again, it's less believed in the modern day, at least in what we might call the Christian or maybe the post-Christian West, and that is, it's right if God commands it. We can look at all kinds of things that God commanded in the Old Testament, and I'm sure that most people who say they believe in this God, if they look at many of these things, they would say, well, no, I would never do that. I would never sacrifice my child just because God said to, or I would never lead an army into a city and kill every man, woman, and child there just because God said to. But that's because of a separation between the social life of Western societies in the last several hundred years and the power of the churches.
Again, to get back to the original point, it's almost as if we pretend that our ethics come from these faiths rather than the other way around.
Well, I think in some cases there is a bit of cynical pretending that our ethics come from this. I think many people sincerely believe that, but I think a lot of that is because it's something that they haven't given much thought to. They were told this from the time they were small children. They're told certain stories, let's say, from the sacred texts from the Bible. They don't ever read the entire thing themselves, and they don't think about them critically. And people like to look for simpler answers. If we really want to delve into the history and the origin and development of human ethics across the multiple societies in the world, that's a lot of work. It's a lot simpler to say, here's a very simple set of rules. They were set down by an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God. He said never disobey what he says, and if he says this, then it is right because he says it. That's simpler, but it doesn't lead us down a particularly productive path.
Ian, thanks very much for doing this today. Great conversation. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Take care.
That's Ian Burchell. His book is called The Ethics of the Faith, Right, Wrong, and the God of Abraham.